we won't be going into the nitty-gritty aspects of all the different work packages, but we'll try to dive a little deeper into the work package number 2 that you see on your screen, that worked on building the knowledge and the evidence base for staff development. This is a work package we conducted throughout the year of 2024, and now we're finishing it. And these are the findings that we're presenting to you today. And then this work is followed by capacity building activities, practice sharing activities under work package 3, and policy contributions under work package 4. So make sure to follow the communication from our project to be informed about this as well. Now, what did we do under work package 2? On the next slide, if we move to the next slide. Yes, thank you, Julia. So we had 3 core activities running under the work package 2 of staff development project. A survey among European higher education institutions that was launched by EUA. We'll have my colleague Therese Zhang, whom you must see on your screen, the Deputy Director for Higher Education Policy here at EUA, who led this whole work and will be presenting the findings from this survey to us. And then we had 2 activities, literature review and a series of focus groups led by colleagues from University College Cork. And we will get a chance today to hear from Catherine O'Mahony, who is with us. She's a director for Center for the Integration of Research, Teaching and Learning at University College Cork. And her 2 colleagues as well, Sinead Gallivan and Katie. I see you are there too with Catherine. So all 3 of them will engage in different parts of the conversation today to present the findings from the literature review and focus group activities of the project. And a brief overview of what these activities were. On my next slide, you will see a few details about the survey, just to say that this was launched between April and July 2024. There were 163 higher education institutions that engaged in this survey, participated from 40 different European higher education area countries. And as you will see with the graphs, they represent a very diverse profile of institutions coming from different sizes of institutions, majority being up to 25,000 student number universities. And in terms of type of institution, majority being comprehensive universities. So a quite diverse profile of institutions that participated in the survey, which also ensures that the findings represent very various perspectives. And then on the next slide, you will see just a few key information points about the focus groups that were conducted, as already mentioned by UCC colleagues. Following the survey, we conducted the focus groups between October and November 2024. In total, there were 16 participants that had a deep dive into the topic of staff development. They all represented about 10 countries from European higher education area, and you can see all the list of the countries on your screen. So this is a brief introduction to the activities that we did, but what is it that we found out, what was interesting in it, and what we would do in the future with these results. To address these questions, I invite first to take over the slides Therese Zhang, who will give us an introduction of how staff development, what did we find out through the activities, how staff development is conceptualized and organized. Therese, the floor is yours.
Thank you very much, Gohar. Hello, good afternoon, everyone, and welcome to this webinar also from my side. So I'm going to provide you with the first overview of exactly what it says on the slide. So how staff development is organized and also conceptualized from the overall picture we managed to capture from the survey. So first of all, I think this also confirms previous research that UA, but not only UA, has conducted in the past, is about the first finding is about how staff development in learning and teaching is actually offered, who is offering it, who most of time in the EHEA, the European Higher Education area, is doing that and offering it. And what we found there is that it's mostly done by individual institutions in the different countries. University networks also do have a role. 63% of our survey respondents of institutions said that they do see a role of university networks organizing things, perhaps also collectively and in common. We also have a third of institutions that said that national, regional level governmental organizations do it. And then it can also be, but to a lesser extent, the role of networks of teachers, NGOs, and also to some extent for-profit organizations. So we have here a situation where basically, and it is really the most common case, institutions themselves implement staff development. The second main finding that we have here is that for institutions that have a learning and teaching strategy, the most common goal or purpose of offering staff development, and this should probably not come as a surprise to you, is to enhance the quality of teaching. So there is really this deep conceptual connection between what we do in staff development and how this would contribute to enhance the quality of teaching. This is actually interesting to consider also in the light of what I will explain later about the way teaching is assessed at institutions, because we will, as we will see, there is not always that connection related to the impact of those activities that is made at institutions. Many institutions also noted that it is part of the institution's commitment to continuous professional development for their staff. This is the case for 78% of institutions that we surveyed, and also more generally speaking, to contribute to career progression of teachers, and as part of the institution's commitment to reach better parity of esteem between the different missions of the institution, namely here between teaching and research mostly. And also in a third of cases, it is to fulfill some kind of legal requirement in countries where staff development is subject to some kind of legal requirement, which is not always the case. Next slide, please. Yes. A second point we examined in detail and will be reflected in the upcoming publication based on the survey results is that we try to offer basically a terminology based on some kind of categories of staff development, what type of activities we're talking about. And in that regard, we identified mainly two of them. The one that we called formal, so organized by the institution, offered by the institution, but with assigned learning objectives, and also some kind of assessment, and that is deemed of more general use. And in our survey, at least 96% of respondents actually answered that they offer it. So there is something formal or formalized offered at the level of institution. But in addition, there are also other types of activities that are more what we call self-organized. So by individuals, by groups, or sometimes even by the institution themselves, but that are typically optional and do not call necessarily for an assessment or for an evaluation in whichever form of completion, let's say. It is also more used for specificities and immediate needs at times. And interestingly, in those, faculties and department also play a big role, which also means that there is this connection between what is needed and also what could be of immediate use in a disciplinary context. And for these type of staff development activities, we can see that 71% of the respondents answered that they do offer it. What we could clearly see also from the results is that those two types actually do not have a clear demarcation line between them. It's intertwined. And also many activities organized by the institution are structured, but do not necessarily include any assessment as such upon completion. Assessment could also take the place of a kind of continuum that could take place, for example, during regular, typically yearly appraisal of the staff member in question, or things like that. So not necessarily a kind of formal assessment at the moment the course or the training finishes. Next slide, please. Okay. Here are some quotes that I think are quite interesting, commenting on the answers that they provided to that survey. In some cases, institutions would see typically formal courses as starting points for participating in communities of practice. So in other words, to build on that, to create and maintain a sense of common belonging, a sense of we are sharing this and that, that is about learning and teaching, and we would like to find a place where to share it. And also for some colleagues who develop into leaders in learning and teaching in their fields, that colleague commented precisely that the concept of standalone training, so one-off, is one that we have stopped investing in, and instead we invest in designing development with the aim of sustained transformation. Another interesting quote here is that, I mean, there are different ways to see it, is that actually self-organized activities could also be considered as little extras, so that this is a bit like the other side of the spectrum, if I compare to the first quote. But also at institutions, it might be quite common to consider that we have a formal baseline introductory offer, for example, for all newly hired staff members, entry-level staff, like the basics, let's say. But from there are also more advanced offers, and also there can be more activities, more self-organized activities proposed. What we can also see, interestingly, is that sometimes it's a question of resources. Formal trainings are seen as prestigious, privilege, also because resources are scarce, hence places are scarce, and it's only under certain conditions that some people may access to it. So this is another type of situation illustrated. And last but not least, there is also institutions might also see this complementarity between formal and self-organized activities as mutually fruitful. So the more formal training there is, the more informal activities will appear as well, because there is also an overall question of the value of staff development in teaching that would be better acknowledged. Next slide, please. Yes. Talking about this value, we tried to collect some feedback through the survey on how institutions would define it. And here we tried to cluster that into three perspectives. The first one that is vastly mentioned is about actually community building and well-being. And we know that since the pandemic, the well-being dimension for staff and for students has really increased in importance at higher education institutions at European level. So under that perspective, what institutions mostly mentioned is the importance of creating and maintaining a sense of community and engagement, and staff development is the mean to achieve that, to contribute to teachers' self-confidence, mutual support, and also overcoming frustration over common challenges. So, a place to vent a bit, but also in a constructive way. From an institutional perspective, and that rightly complements also the next one, that is the staff perspective, individual staff member perspective. From the institution side, it's also about creating and maintaining a sense of accountability and also supporting the institution's vision for learning and teaching across disciplines, departments, and with an emphasis sometimes on similar values and competences. One concrete example of that is, for example, when institutions, and there were quite a few of them mentioning, we would like to promote student-based, student-centered learning. We would like to promote active learning, and this needs somehow to be translated also into the way students go through, live it through classrooms, and so it is reflected in our staff development offer. The individual development perspective includes this idea of supporting the implementation of newly acquired competences, teaching competences into classrooms, but also just better informing teachers, broaden their capacity to address transversal aspects in their teaching, and also improving their awareness to engage students through active learning methods. That is something that came back also quite a few times. And last but not least, and this is probably also related to the aftermath, let's say, of the pandemic, helping to tackle new challenges. Digitalization came as one that everybody had perhaps in mind, but also more generally be agile and resilient also towards new development, and how learning and teaching could take that into account. I think I will stop here for now. Yes, and pass the floor to my UCC colleagues who will also complement this from their findings from the focus groups. Thank you.
Thank you. Can I get the next slide, Julia? I'm Sinead and I'm going to be presenting on behalf of the ECC. So when we reviewed the literature around the conceptualization and organisation of staff development in higher education, it's clear that there was a high degree of variability across various institutions. One factor that contributed to this variability was the lack of national legislation making staff development a requirement or promoting recognition or reward for staff when they do engage in staff development. Most higher education institutions do offer some form of staff development, with most of these offerings being voluntary and there being a high degree of variation in the scope and duration of these offerings. 65% of higher education institutions surveyed across the EHEA have teaching and learning centres at institutional level. Increasingly, we're also seeing sectoral level investment in teaching and learning development. Next slide, please. So participants in the focus groups outlined a range of incentives that are now embedded within their institutions to promote engagement, recognising the need for engagement to have tangible value to staff. Incentives included providing funding for learning and teaching development, allocating time for teaching development, prioritisation and strategy, recognition and promotion criteria, and valuing research into teaching and learning. We've named this the institutionalisation of staff development, and there are three main tensions evident, which I'll discuss in the next slide. Can I get the next slide, please? Thank you. It was common practice in the examples shared in the focus group for staff development to be compulsory as part of the onboarding of new academic staff. However, beyond this initial bit of mandatory training, participation in staff development was largely voluntary, and participants also emphasised the importance of staff development being voluntary and promoting true engagement. Next slide, please. Exploring voluntary staff development further, there are two ideological approaches. The first is staff development in response to staff needs. The second is providing staff development that is aligned with established standards or core competences, which can also aggregate into a form of qualification. The sentiment that staff development should be informed by staff needs was salient across the entire dataset in relation to both the content and delivery of staff development initiatives. From Stad Newens talk about the tension between the emancipatory aims of staff development, so empowering staff to critique their practices and question broader strategies, policies, and organisational culture, and the more domesticating aims, so development in line with institutional standards. If staff development offerings are to be standardised, then who decides what are core competencies? What does implementation look like? Will this be coordinated at an institutional, national, or even European level? If staff development is needs-based, what mechanism will be used to gather this input, and how can it be aligned with institutional strategy over a longer time horizon? In some cases, the institutional standards are well integrated into institutional priorities. One higher education institution shared that the teaching and learning unit had actually been restructured as the broader staff felt its focus didn't support institutional priorities. Next slide, please. So we also observed this tension between expressed staff needs and the institutional or national priorities or requirements while exploring the role of teaching and learning centres. In one focus group, we spoke to a group of directors of teaching and learning centres, and one participant told us that their unit is purely dedicated to staff needs, and another shared that their centre was re-established with the primary goal of accomplishing various institutional objectives. Blackmore and Blackwell described how teaching and learning centres often play a mediating role between the realities of institutional life and the traditional beliefs and values of academic staff. National drivers and institutional priorities can collide with academics' views and understanding of their disciplines and the role of departments in affecting change. Centres for teaching and learning, or equivalent units, provide an important function in translating strategy into practice. Staff in such centres are responsible for helping colleges and universities function effectively as teaching and learning communities. So I think I'll hand you back to Gohar there.
Yes, indeed. Thank you to both of you for sharing this insights with us from the research conducted. To our audience, in a couple of weeks, you will have findings from this research also in a written form available to you as publications. I'll make another announcement about it again by the end of the event, but just please make note that what we heard is a glimpse to what we have found out. So there's a lot more that that you can explore once the publications are out. But thank you, Jeanette and Therese, for the insights shared. We will have a poll now to engage you all as audience a little bit in this discussion. If we oh, the slides disappeared.
Yes, it's just for me to launch the poll.
Okay. Okay, thank you, Julia. Yeah, so we will launch a poll now to just ask you, how do you relate so far to what has been shared by the speakers? So, you know, all that you heard about the value of staff development, the way it's conceptualized, the way it's organized, the role teaching and learning centers play, the way it's institutionalized as an activity, staff development. Just please indicate on this poll, how do you relate to this so far, from your experience, from the context that you come from? That will give us a little bit of an idea of how these findings that we have relate to wider audiences. And I see that the options are running rather evenly, which is interesting. Shows again the diversity of the participants that we have and the landscape that we're working with, the diversity of staff development landscape across Europe. Thank you all so much. The poll, I believe, will remain open for you to vote for a few more, maybe some more seconds, as I see we have 74 people who voted so far, which is not bad. Thank you very much. And yeah, as Therese just mentioned in the chat, please feel free to share some of your comments if you do not relate at all to what we found, because that will give us a little bit of an understanding of if we missed something somewhere, or if there is a system that completely does not relate to what we're talking about. And also, if you relate fully or are somewhere in between, but want to share something, please do. And I will have a quick look at the chat now to see if we have any questions that could be addressed at the moment. Okay, so it seems like a few people have been confused when answering the poll. So I assume that if there was a mistake with not relating at all, you either somewhat relate or relate completely, which is helpful to know. Thank you for that. Okay, I do not see questions in the chat. I look at my colleagues who are the speakers. If you do not see questions either, then I suggest we move to the next. You see one question. Oh,
Sorry, Goha. I think
yes.
there was someone who asked, what is a learning and teaching center or teaching?
Yes, now I see it. Thank you very
Yes.
much. Indeed, the question is, please clarify what is meant by teaching and learning centers. And I believe this was mentioned in UCC's presentation. Colleagues from UCC, would you like to?
Hi there. Yeah, so I suppose in many units or institutions, they may have a kind of a central unit that has responsibility for the formal or informal staff development. So these can sometimes be considered teaching and learning centers where they have a specific function. It could be someone with a dedicated responsibility. As Gohar said, there's a lot of diversity across the European higher education area. But as we saw with the Trends report, these seem to be a kind of a more common establishment. And even in the post-pandemic world, there was actually quite a significant investment and even at a national level in setting up and maintaining such centres so they can have a diversity of roles, but the general perspective is staff development and teaching and learning.
Thank you very much, Catherine, for the answer. And I see there is one more question, and we have time for just one more question to pick it up, and it relates to what is the exact definition of staff used in our project? Does it include everybody working at a university? And I would invite Therese to answer the question, as I know we had a lot of discussions about this.
Yes, well, first of all, I would like to add on the previous question. In the survey, we actually run a question about the institutions having or not a learning and teaching center. And I think if I remember correctly, about 2/3, perhaps a bit less, yeah, about 70%, I think, of institutions answer that do have such a center. But this can be at central level, at institutional level, but also at faculty level, and sometimes also both. So universities can also have such centers, both located at faculty level and also at institutional level. This is consistent with the answers we have received for the same question in the past 5 to 6 years. When we surveyed institutions in Europe about the same matters. So seems to be a trend there. So sorry, back to your question, staff. So we broadly defined in the survey, staff here as basically staff members with responsibilities in student learning generally. There was no distinction as such between between the different stages, let's say, at the university. However, one of the findings of the survey that I did not have time to mention now, but will be featured also in the publication, clearly shows that the staff development offers in learning and teaching that are available at the institution are mostly there for people who teach. So academic staff, research who teach, PhDs who are engaged in a PhD who teach, etc. But for non-academic staff members, the offer is a bit more scarce, and also they are more likely to be optional. So I hope this answers the question. I also see that somebody asked in the chat box, does the research include England, Scotland, and Wales? We did that nationally, so not by nation. So I would not be able to answer that question, but in the survey report, of course, there is a map including the number of responses that we have received from the UK. Thank you.
I might just come back in on the question about a bottom-up approach to staff development, whether it can be sustainable in the long term. I think the ideal model is where staff needs are also articulated and form the institutional strategy. So there's a kind of a circular informing, and then that then plays out in a staff development offer that falls out from institutional strategy. But this is idealized. I think, like we've seen, where resources and pressures are in place, those responsive one-off activities are harder to justify.
Thank you very much, Catherine, for picking up on that question as well. I think with this, we can move from the Q&A part to the next section of the webinar, and then we will have another little moment for questions as well. So everyone in the audience, please do not be discouraged. Keep on sending your questions down. I'll be monitoring the chat. Now we will have a second poll. We're moving to the third part of our webinar to discuss how universities support professional development for teachers in relation to recognition and career progression. And before we hear from our speakers, I would invite you all, as I said, to reflect to another poll question. If Julia, you could please pull up the second poll that we have prepared. In this poll, we invite you to just identify, what do you think, sorry, I need to open my own slide. Oh, yes. What do you think at your institution is teaching sufficiently recognized through assessment and careers? And hopefully here, the options for answering are less confusing to you, because you just need to say yes or no, or I don't know. So please feel free to indicate what's the state that that really your institution is in. How is teaching actually sufficiently recognized through assessment and careers? Yeah, it is sad to see that the answer is no, identified by the majority of the participants. We will hear now from our speakers. What did we find out in relation to this through the survey conducted, through the literature review, and through the focus groups? And to do this, I invite Therese to take the floor again.
Yes, thank you, Gohar. Oh, the next slide is already there, so let's continue. I will first go through a bit through in the continuation of what was explained before about how formal staff development is offered, and also to what extent it is voluntary and to what extent it is mandatory. So compulsory or optional is another type of vocabulary we used in the survey too. Well, the first finding that I should perhaps highlight here is that there are many gray zones. So courses as such might not be compulsory, but it might be required under some circumstances, and also depending on the stage of experience and advancement of the staff member in question. So it can be not compulsory, but for example, required for staff to take them in the course of their career, or to take them in the course of the upcoming 5-6 years, etc., etc. So it depends a bit on the stages of the person, but it mostly depends on the state of advancement in career and teaching experience. But what we can clearly see is that it is mostly, where it is compulsory, it is mostly compulsory for newly hired academic staff. So again, there is this idea that we also expressed before of this baseline introductory offer, most of time on basics in pedagogy, university pedagogy, etc., that universities would offer to newcomers to their institution, just to make sure that we kickstart on the same basis. And then we also see that it can be compulsory for teachers or assistant professors or equivalent, but it is much less the case for more senior teachers or even for full professors. What we can also see is that it is compulsory for PhD candidates and or postdocs or equivalent in a bit less than 30% of institutions only, but there is generally a big share of institutions that answered it is actually optional for them, formal staff development offers. Interestingly, and this also relates to one of the questions that popped up already earlier, is that, first of all, for non-academic staff still involved in student learning, so typically technicians in labs, librarians, teaching support staff, etc., the offer is mostly optional, rarely compulsory. And also, this is also the case for newly hired non-academic staff. And the second point that perhaps is interesting to pin down here is that for staff following negative teaching evaluations, so in case of bad teaching, let's say, actually there are very few institutions only that address this through staff development by making it compulsory. So this kind of offer is not exactly the norm, and let's say it probably also means that staff development is not necessarily seen as a mean to remedy to shortcomings that were identified through negative teaching evaluations. Next slide, please. All right, so here what we try to identify are the challenges for proposing and also organizing staff development. And interestingly, and this has also been identified in the previous projects that we were involved in, it is the question of time. So time required from teachers to participate, which also relates to an overall question of workload for staff, for teachers that already have it on their plate. We already mentioned the kind of competition complementarity with research activities, with the research mission, but definitely there is an overall question of how to utilize time and also how to make time to participate in such activities. It is followed by, for 2/3 of the entering institutions, by the teacher's motivation, which might also be intrinsically linked to some other options that are listed below, such as the value of teaching in academic life, and also the effect on teachers' career progression. So generally, we can see that the overall recognition for teaching does play a role in the way, but also in the overall engagement into staff development. Another point that was another, let's say, set of challenges that were identified and are also quite interesting is the difficulty to engage a circle of motivated teachers who participate. So creating, let's say, a critical mass who would be interested in such activities, but also would contribute to them through communities of practice, etc. But also the difficulty to grow beyond a certain number of, let's say, usual suspects, people who engage already, are interested in teaching, and also do come back regularly whenever the Learning and Teaching Center or the faculty department organize such activities. Interestingly, about 1/4 of institutions also mentioned that most teachers are not comfortable with reflecting on their teaching practices. And this is perhaps a point also to be noted, because this relates really to an individual endeavor and also to an endeavor that I think still takes place in an academic culture and context where teaching is often seen as an individual activity, as compared to research, for example. Researching in teams is very, very widespread and common. Team teaching, but also more generally addressing teaching, talking about teaching with colleagues, it is perhaps a bit less widespread. Well, actually, we can clearly see that teaching is a collective activity as well. You have committees to design curriculum. You have also this overall role of educational developers, sometimes in faculties, etc. So it's not a one-to-one activity, but still there is a question really of discomfort about sharing and reflecting on teaching practices. Yeah, sorry, I see that there is a little oversight on the slide with the same option being featured twice for some reason. Something bugged there. Sorry about that. It is correct normally in the publication that will be published at the end of January. Next slide, please. Yes, could you press once again, because I think something needs to fly in. Yes, okay, there was something missing on my left side. This is data collected from our latest milestone report of HEIs Trends 24 that was published in July. We had a sample of, I think, 480 in some institutions from across the EHEA. And we asked the question indeed about the role of teaching performance evaluations in career progression. Do you take that into account in the career progression of your staff? What we can see here is that actually half of the institutions answered yes, although another 41% answered a minor role only compared to other criteria. But if we take the half full glass, we would be tempted to say, well, it's actually not that bad, that half of institutions said yes, we do take that into account. However, what we can also see, you can go to the next slide, please. Oh, there is a QR code. Sorry, that flew in as well. What we could also see and hear from the institutions is that even in the cases that it does play a role in career progression, it is still sometimes a bit difficult, a bit ad hoc, following practices that would not necessarily provide as much value to good teaching as limiting negative impact of bad teaching, let's say. So if you have bad teaching performances, it might hinder, but if you have excellent teaching records, it might not necessarily help for career progression, these type of cases. And also the overall issue here that remains a bit and is the way teaching could be assessed and could be taken into account in career progression. What we can see is that most widespread practice in this regard is still student feedback. So student evaluations, this is the case in almost all institutions in the EHEA, but institutions also commented that they need to improve how to approach teaching performance evaluations, and there are ways actually to do it better and probably also to do it in a more meaningful way. So what would be more appropriate and complementary tools in this regard? Institutions identified, for example, the use of teaching portfolios, also in an attempt to boost reflection on own teaching. 43% of institutions surveyed use it, but some others are also planning to introduce it, and also peer feedback systems with 1/3 of institutions using it, and some others also planning to introduce it. Could I have the next slide, please? Yes. So in the staff dev survey, we tried to have a little bit more of details regarding how formal staff development leads, so those that call upon some kind of assessment or certificate or something upon completion, how does that account for career progression? What we can see is that about half, again, it's about half of institutions actually do take that into account for staff in a permanent or in a temporary position. But what some institutions also pointed out, I thought that was a quite interesting remark actually, was that early stage or new academic staff might be actually more motivated to participate with staff development, but for more senior staff members, it might also be a question to incentivize them to participate by taking that into account for career progression. So if you have participated and have completed formal staff development, you may count for your career progression. There are typical moments, let's say, in academic life where typical processes where such activities can be taken into account and need also to be documented when academic staff start their position, but also in the context of a periodical evaluation, typically appraisals, upon renewal of a contract for fixed-term contracts in the case of temporary staff, and also when moving from a temporary to a more permanent status at the institution. In that regard, we could also see that there were quite strong country differences, actually. So in some countries, it is quite widespread, actually, to take staff development into account in career progression. I have some countries mentioned there. I won't list them all, but they are, of course, also listed in the report. But it is much less the case in some other countries. So there is a kind of difference in academic cultures, let's say, in that regard, and it is also the case for the career progression of permanent staff. It's very commonly done in some countries, but much less the case, and probably also quite novel in some other countries. I will end here by saying that the way actually teaching plays a role in career progression is not always clear. There is a very blurry zone between what is compulsory, what is actually not compulsory, but should be an incentive, and also what is optional, but yet it's still nicer to have it. So there is not always a big clarity in this going through all the institutional regulations. This might also be related to a blurry zone that is also present in national regulations as well. Could you please go to the next slide? Yes. I'm just concluding for my part as well, at least here, by saying that the overall picture that comes out from that is that self-development is much more seen as part of a teaching ecosystem, if I can call it so, because it's really a question of encompassing, but also connecting the institution strategies, the priorities for learning and teaching, but also adequate support structures, what is relevant to offer as activities for developing learning and teaching, but also importantly, recognition for the time and effort dedicated to improve teaching. And the overall value of staff development is intertwined really with the value that institutions would grant to the teaching activities as part of the academic profession. And that's probably the main point here. It is also interesting to see the value of an evidence-informed approach to staff development. So what exactly works? How do we know that it works, actually? How do we collect data on that? In what ways? Following what indicators? And is the offer adequate and relevant to teachers' needs? Sinead made a very strong point about that earlier, which I think is really worth reflection, is to kind of also consider the overall balance between what the institution want and what are the teachers, the individual teachers, but also collectively the teachers' needs, how to balance that and how to make it so that the offering is adequate, but also makes everyone happy at the end of the day and is useful to enhance teaching generally. So both top-down and bottom-up approaches are needed. The steering is needed from the institutional and the national levels. We had a few institutions commenting that they expect leadership, institutional leadership, to take a role in that, and also openness to consider grassroots initiatives that come from teachers. I think this was my last slide, and I give the floor to my UCC colleagues. Thank you.
So the existing literature surrounding how professional development for teachers is supported within higher education institutions shows that the quality of teaching remains undervalued and overshadowed by research achievement. We also found that there is an increasing emphasis on staff development and quality criteria, which has encouraged HEIs to ensure new staff have a minimum level of competence. Next slide, please. So the participants in the focus groups emphasise the importance of staff development being valued in career progression, following on from what Therese was talking about earlier, in order to promote engagement. Other forms of recognition, such as awards and small grants, were also identified as motivators of engagement. Perfect. One outcome of engagement in staff development was an increased interest in pedagogical research and a growing interest in attending conferences and publishing research in the area of teaching and learning. This, in turn, was identified as a motivator to continue engaging with staff development. This increased interest in pedagogical research served both to develop the evidence base in the area of teaching and learning, as well as to support staff in achieving professional goals, which might require published research. Next slide, please. Although staff development initiatives must be relevant to career progression to ensure that a participant offers staff concrete benefits, the incentivization model also has the potential to undermine the benefits associated with voluntary staff development. The quote on the slide shows how one participant discussed how meaningful engagement can be eluded where staff development is required for career progression. This notion of staff development being seen as a tick box exercise to ensure promotion was mentioned by a few participants. However, other participants spoke of a culture of teaching and learning and highlighted the importance of continued support as a follow-on from engaging in staff development initiatives. Participants flagged the development of emergent networks as a consequence of engaging in staff development. This was congruent with the concept of significant work networks, as discussed by Roxa and Martinson, which support the cultivation of a culture of teaching and learning. When exploring the key outcomes of staff development, the overwhelming majority of participants discussed peer learning and exchange and the value of connecting with other teachers in higher education. Further, this connection can also foster community within an institution and be productive against academic burnout. Similarly, participants highlighted the value of staff development initiatives in providing a space for staff to feel heard and valued. Next slide, please. Insufficient dedicated time and the volatility of institutional and national support were the two main barriers to engagement in staff development identified within the focus groups. When these were explored more deeply, participants suggested that time constraints were reflective of the institutional value placed on staff development. Staff needed allocated time to engage in staff development, and the lack of this provision is indicative of a misalignment between strategy and practice. The planning and delivery of staff development initiatives takes place within institutional and national contexts. A prominent reflection across all of the focus groups was that beyond a lack of resources, the instability of institutional and national support for teaching and learning was a major barrier. Further, a lack of stability in budget allocation for teaching and learning presents a hindrance in establishing evidence-based frameworks for staff development. This perspective was particularly present amongst directors of teaching and learning centres, who shared how this instability had a knock-on effect on the quality and continuity of staff development offerings, which can in turn inhibit the maturation of staff development provision, in line with Palmer et al. Next slide, please. So to summarise the key findings from our literature review and focus groups, we identified a number of tensions in relation to staff development due to competing priorities at individual, institutional and national levels. It was also clear that perceptions around barriers to engagement or potential negative impacts of incentivization structures could be due to a misalignment between institutional strategies and observed practices. Really, in terms of dedicated time being allocated to staff development and the role of staff development in career progression. We also identified a move towards standardization. While at present there is great variation in terms of the design, organisation, and implementation of staff development, there is a growing consensus on the benefits of identifying common standards or core competencies for teachers in higher education. Equally, the focus groups highlighted the need to balance this standardised approach with the responsiveness to the dynamic needs of teaching staff. So that's everything from me. I think it's back to Gohar now.
Yes, thanks, Jeanette, and thanks, Therese, for the presentations. This has been very insightful to hear. My intention was to give a floor to everyone for another Q&A round. However, looking at the time, I'm afraid we're running out of it. So this can be an opportunity and an encouragement for you all to engage materials from the event on our event platform, of which we mentioned at the very beginning of the event. You can find there the slides, you can interact with the rest of the participants, and the speakers have access to this too. So feel free to post any of your questions there. Julia, if we could move to the next slide, please. I will... Yes, thank you. I'll just briefly introduce to you all the next steps that will be conducted under the project, as many of you have been so far asking also in the chat how you can engage, what kind of Erasmus mobilities could there be that address this topic. We're happy to let you know that we do have interesting activities going on. So first, we have 3 thematic peer groups that we will be launching shortly. The call for this activity has already finished, unfortunately, last week, so you can't participate in it anymore, but you can look forward to the outcomes that will be published from the work of these 3 thematic peer groups in early 2026. There will be 3 different reports addressing specific aspects of staff development, so keep an eye on that. And we also have an upcoming masterclass that will be hosted by the end of May by our colleagues at UCC. Colleagues, would you like to take the floor, say anything brief about it?
So the purpose of the masterclass in Cork, which is happening in May, is looking at kind of transitions and transformations in staff development. For those of you that are leading out on maybe staff development, that perhaps you're trying to reattune it to institutional strategy, maybe you're starting off and you want to embed it and kind of maybe strengthen its position within an institution, that's really the masterclass that would be for you guys.
Thanks, Catherine. And yes, Therese, anything to add?
Yeah, I see that there are some questions in the chat regarding participation to the masterclass. I won't answer them all because actually it's all in the link, but just to make it short, it is free, thanks Erasmus Plus co-funding, in the sense that there is no fee. However, you need to provide for yourself for traveling there and also for subsistence and accommodation. So basically, yeah, one of the possibilities that it is up to you to explore if you are interested is also to look into the Erasmus Plus staff mobility schemes. All the information is in the link anyway, so don't hesitate to have a look if you're interested to apply before March. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Therese. And in addition to these activities, we will also launch by the end of this month the publications from which we presented you information today. So keep an eye on for that. Follow our project on the social media, check regularly EUA's website, subscribe to our newsletter. On the next slide, you will see further information, whether that's a hashtag of our project, contact email address, but also here you see when will the next EUA webinar be. That is on our timeline. That will be 20th of February. So you can also check this on our website. And with this, I want to thank you all very much. Thank you to our excellent speakers, Catherine, Katie, Jeanette, not just for being here with us today, but also for all the enormous work you have done so far for this project and all the expertise you have shared with us. Thank you, Therese, for being here and for all the work you have done on leading this project so far. Yeah, we're excited for the future of the project, and we thank you all for attending the event today, and just encourage you to, yeah, stay connected to this project. If you do have that interest of understanding more staff development, understanding more teaching and learning centers and how this whole ecosystem works, but also how we can work better. We hope to offer this to you through this project, and look forward to connecting with you all in the future. Thank you, everyone.